You are walking past a newspaper stand when a headline catches your eye. Austria-Hungary's Archduke Francis Ferdinand assassinated in Sarajevo. Your first thought is, who's he? You pick up the paper and read about the Archduke and about the rising tension in Europe related to his death. The article makes it sound like Europe is about to explode into war. At this point, do you think the assassination will affect the United States? Why or why not? Outbreak of war. Though Europe was at peace in the early 1900s, relations between European nations were not necessarily friendly. In fact, feelings of fear and distrust were growing among European powers such as Germany, France, Great Britain, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. This dangerous tension had several important causes. Tensions in Europe. One cause of tension was the rise of nationalism in the 1800s. Nationalism is a strong sense of pride and loyalty to one's nation or culture. Nationalism inspired people who shared a language or a culture to want to unite politically. In 1871, for example, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm I brought together several German states to form the nation of Germany. While nationalism helped bring stability to Germany, it caused instability in other places. The Empire of Austria-Hungary included people from many different cultural groups. One of these groups was the Slavs. Slavic nationalists wanted to break away from Austria-Hungary and join the independent Slavic country of Serbia on the Balkan Peninsula. Leaders of Austria-Hungary reacted angrily, seeing this movement as a threat to their empire. Another source of tension in Europe was imperialism. Britain's huge empire, stretching from Africa to Asia, brought it wealth and power. Eager to share such benefits, other European powers competed for control of overseas territories. Fierce competition for territory took place within Europe as well. For example, Germany had taken the Alsace-Lorraine region from France in the Franco-Prussian War. In 1871, France wanted it back. In this competitive atmosphere, nations focused their resources on militarism, the aggressive strengthening of armed forces. European nations raced to build armies and navies that were larger than ever before. As nations became more powerful, they sought to protect themselves by forming new alliances. Germany formed an alliance with Austria-Hungary. In 1879, in the alliance system, each promised to defend the other in case of enemy attack. Concerned with Germany's growing power, France and Russia created their own alliance in 1893. Britain joined France and Russia in 1907. The spark, with so much hostility dividing the nations of Europe, a German general felt that a European war is bound to come sooner or later. All that we needed was a spark to set Europe on fire. That spark flew from the Balkan province of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bosnia and Herzegovina had gained independence from Turkish rule in 1878. In 1908, however, Austria-Hungary annexed the province. Slavic nationalists resisted violently. They wanted the region to be part of Serbia. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Francis Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, visited the province's capital of Sarajevo with his wife Sophie. While riding through the streets, they were shot and killed by a 19-year-old Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. The assassination shattered Europe's fragile peace. Determined to crush Serbia and the Slavic nationalists, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Very quickly, other countries were pulled into the fighting. Russia had promised to support Serbia in the case of war. It began to mobilize or prepare its military for war. On August 1st, Germany, Austria-Hungary's ally, declared war on Russia. 2 days later, Germany also declared war on France, Russia's ally. To reach France quickly, the German army marched into Belgium on August 4th. Britain, which had promised to support Belgium, then declared war on Germany. As the fighting started, the alliance between Austria-Hungary and Germany came to be known as the Central Powers. Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire later sided with the Central Powers. France, Russia, and Britain were known as the Allied Powers. Italy joined them in 1950. Over the next several years, soldiers from 30 nations and 6 continents would fight in what was then called the Great War. The conflict later became known as World War I. So there's a picture of the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand and his wife Sophie by a Serb nationalist. Early battles of the war. Both sides expected the war to be over in a few months. German leaders planned to defeat France quickly before Russia could join the fighting. But as the Germans marched toward France, they met fierce resistance from Belgian soldiers. This gave Britain and France time to mobilize their own troops. New military technologies changed military strategy and resulted in an unprecedented number of casualties. The First Battle of the Marne. Belgian resistance slowed the German advance, but could not stop it. On September 3rd, the German army was just 25 miles from Paris, the capital of France. The French army blocked the German advance at the Marne River, east of Paris. The First Battle of the Marne raged for several days before the Germans were pushed back. By mid-September, French and German troops faced each other along a long battle line called the Western Front. The Western Front stretched from the North Sea all the way to Switzerland. Meanwhile, the Russian and German armies were struggling back and forth along the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front, which from the Black Sea is to the Baltic. It quickly became clear that this war would be longer and deadlier than anyone had expected. A new kind of war. Part of what made World War I so long and deadly was a new technology called trench warfare. In trench warfare, soldiers defended a position by fighting from a protection of deep ditches. When the French defeated the Germans in the First Battle of the Marne, the Germans did not retreat far. Instead, they dug trenches nearby. Opposite them, the French dug their own trenches. A 400-mile-long network of trenches soon stretched across the Western Front. So, here's a picture of the trenches used during the war. Trenches were dug in a zigzag pattern so that the enemy could not stand at one end and fire down the length of a trench. Some trenches served as first aid posts. Airplanes could scout enemy positions and drop bombs into trenches. Tanks were not damaged by either machine gun or rifle fire. Their use marked the beginning of the end for trench warfare. No man's land was the area between opposing trenches. It was about 250 yards wide and full of barbed wire and abandoned military equipment. Okay. Soldiers fought in these cold, wet, and muddy ditches, sometimes for months at a time. The filthy trenches were perfect breeding grounds for germs. Soldiers on both sides died from disease. An American in the French army described life in the trenches. The impossibility of the simplest kind of personal cleanliness makes vermin, bugs, a universal ill, against which there is no remedy. Cold, dirt, discomfort are the ever-present conditions, and the soldier's life comes to mean the most misery that the human organism or body can support. The empty patch of ground between enemy trenches came to be known as no man's land. This area was quickly stripped of trees and blasted full of holes by artillery shells. Anyone who ventured into no man's land was likely to be killed by enemy fire. Another factor that made World War I deadlier than previous wars was the use of modern technology. New machine guns, for example, could fire 400 to 600 bullets a minute. Enormous artillery guns fired shells over the trenches. The shells exploded and sent speeding scraps of metal onto the soldiers below. Other shells spread poisonous gases. If soldiers were not wearing gas masks, the gas destroyed their lungs, causing slow, painful deaths. Poisonous gases were originally banned, but came back into use by both sides by the end of the war. This was called chemical warfare. Other new weapons included tanks and aircraft, including airplanes. Tanks are armored combat vehicles that can cause heavy damage but cannot be destroyed easily. Airplanes were used to fire down on soldiers in trenches. And to gather information about enemy locations. Airplanes also battled each other in fights called dogfights. Many of the weapons first used in World War I, such as tanks and airplanes, are still used in warfare today. This use of poison gas, however, has been outlawed by international treaties. Okay, there's a picture of a man in a trench. The image shows British soldiers firing the machine gun and wearing early gas masks to protect against a gas attack. Land and sea battles. After a year of vicious fighting, the war had become a stalemate, a situation in which neither side can win a decisive victory. Determined to break the stalemate, both sides launched massive attacks. In February 1916, the Germans attacked the French city of Verdun at the southern end of the Western Front. That summer, the Allies staged an attack along the Somme River in northeastern France. Both battles raged for months as the armies attacked and counterattacked. By the end of the year, the Germans had failed to take Verdun. At the Somme River, the Allies had advanced just 7 miles. Almost nothing had changed on the Western Front, but nearly 1 million men had been killed at Verdun and the Somme River. As the stalemate on land dragged on, sea battles in the Atlantic Ocean and the North Sea became even more important. The powerful British Navy blockaded the ports of the Central Powers. They also laid explosive mines in the North Sea. This could blow a huge hole in a ship, sinking it in minutes. The tactics effectively stopped ships from reaching German ports with needed supplies. The Germans responded by using submarines called U-boats. U-boats launched torpedoes against Allied supply ships, causing heavy losses. The Germans also attacked ships belonging to neutral countries they believed were helping the Allies. This would soon pull the United States into World War I. Summary and preview. World War I became a stalemate by 1916 as countries battled for control. In the next lesson, you will find out why the United States decided to join the fighting. Okay, so there is a picture of a German U-boat. Germany developed small submarines called U-boats as part of its war strategy. U-boats could strike Allied ships without being seen. They destroyed around 10 million tons of Allied and neutral ships and cargo from 1914 to 1918.